Okay, I think we'll start our lecture. My name is Jim Dubert, and I'm a student member of the ISU Lectures Committee. And tonight I have the privilege of starting our lectures program for this year, introducing our speaker for this evening. Our speaker for this evening is a person which some of you may have heard about this last year, being that this is the bicentennial year. The gentleman who will be talking tonight is a co-founder of the People's Bicentennial Commission, People's Bicentennial Commission. He's been, the commission, PBC as it's usually called, has been around for about 5 years now, and it has almost 20,000 members. I guess he just said it has around 20,000 members. I guess it's growing all the time. The gentleman himself has helped author a book and has traveled and lectured on the activities of the People's Bicentennial Commission. It's been commented by a lot of authors and papers around the country that the PBC is a true revolutionary spirit in this country. It represents the modern idea of the revolutionary spirit, I guess is the best way to say it. Anyhow, the ideals of people like Thomas Paine, people like Thomas Jefferson, Sam Adams are being arisen through this new group. And hopefully through the lecture tonight you'll understand more about what this new spirit he's trying to rise in people is about, and what the purpose of the PPC is, and how we all have to join in this purpose. With little more ado, I'd like to just let him take over and sock it all to you, I guess, so we're all inspired for the rest of this bicentennial year to really get out and work for the people, which we all are. So I'd like to introduce to you right now a really good person, Mr. Ted Howard. Thank you.
Well, I realized last night as I was watching TV that in Washington where I live, that I was going to be here tonight just about the same time that Bob Dylan is having his first special on TV. So I imagine that we'll get done in time for everybody to go see Bob Dylan if that's what you're interested in. And I want to thank you for coming. It's always good to know that some contemporary politics are still of interest to people. First of all, about the bicentennial. People's Bicentennial Commission has been around for 5 years. And while Jim commented about the rest of the bicentennial, it's really all over. So I'm sort of standing here talking about a bicentennial that, in a sense, has already passed. It reached its peak on July 4th. I hope you all enjoyed America's biggest birthday party. Back east, there was a really big bash. The tall ships came into New York. I know you didn't get that out here. They got off to kind of a bad start. Just before they got into New York Harbor, a bunch of them ran into each other. So that's sort of a bicentennial failure. And then the whole bicentennial had a lot of problems with it for a number of reasons. Some of the things just went wrong. For instance, the largest flag in the world was made for our bicentennial. They hung it from George Washington Bridge beginning on July 1st, but it never made it to the big day. On July 3rd, it fell down. It tore and fell into the river in New York. And then Viking was supposed to land. I'm sure you've been following all the news about Viking landing on Mars. It was all set up to land on July 4th, but it didn't make it either. So everything got postponed a little bit. Some things didn't happen. So I guess it's just as appropriate that I'm here right now. And one of the reasons I think that, not that stuff happened, but one of the problems that we just witnessed, the 200th anniversary of one of the most meaningful social events in the history of the world, the American Revolution, and yet very few of us partook in it. There wasn't much concern nationally with it. Certainly there wasn't much direction from the White House and governing institutions, and I think that was because it's very difficult for today's establishment to celebrate yesterday's revolution. I mean, it's sort of an Art Buchwald fantasy. Imagine President Ford 200 years ago. Just think of Jerry Ford and put him in the context of the American Revolution, running through the street with Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty, boarding the tea ship, illegally throwing the tea off the ship 200 years ago. Or imagine the chieftains of ITT or CBS or Pepsi-Cola involved in the revolution, attacking wealthy merchants and landlords, tarring and feathering, boycotting the tax collector. I mean, it's just a little bit too much. And that catch-22 was something that this society could never deal with. Now, as a context, although the day or the event of the bicentennial, July 4th, is past, faded into history, and will probably be the subject of a number of books when the tricentennial comes around, as a context, the bicentennial is still relevant. because the events of 200 years ago and the principles that launched this country provide a forum or a context to look at our nation today and see how we measure up. And I'd like to just go through a couple things that I see about the country today before we start talking about the past and what the American Revolution was really all about. Now, let me see a show of hands. You know, the elections are coming up November 2nd, it's the big day, the annual 4-year Run for the Roses. How many people here are planning to vote? Okay, so, and voting for President of the United States, a presidential candidate? Very good. You're an exceptional group. There's a poll that just came out, you might have seen the other day. 50% of the American public, for the first time in the last 50 years, is not going to vote on November 2nd. For the first time, over half of the eligible electorate is not going to vote on November 2nd. And this is an astounding thing. If you compare it to other democratic societies, in Australia they've got about 95% of the eligible electorates voting, West Germany 90%. There are 2 or 3 societies that are democratic that have a lower voter turnout than we do. One of them is India. We saw what happened in India recently, how it's become something of a dictatorship, and the other is Botswana. Now, I don't know a lot about Botswana, but we in Botswana are right down there at the bottom of the democratic heap, and we're the country that started it all 200 years ago. But that's where we're at, and I'm not sure that I'm going to vote this November 2nd. I might vote for some city council elections or school boards in Washington. And there's not much choice in Washington, D.C., since we're still a colony 200 years after the Revolution. But I look at the 2 presidential candidates, and I don't see much to choose from there. I mean, there's Jimmy Carter, the little peanut farmer, and he's running around America talking pretty generally about how he wants this country to be as good and sincere and compassionate and caring and et cetera as you and I are. And I like that rhetoric, but I don't see much coming out of it. It sort of seems to me like a giant Boy Scout jamboree might be coming to the country after November 2nd, but that's about all. And then President Ford. Do you watch the news? Like, I watch Walter Cronkite every night. It's the most bizarre thing to see the news, and you see, say, Nelson Benton standing with his microphone in front of the White House, and he's giving you the campaign strategy, and he says, and so the strategy is that Jimmy Carter says his strategy is to appear sincere. Just think about that. He's going to appear sincere. And President Ford is going to stay in the White House and appear presidential. Very bizarre, but that's what's happening during the election. Did you all watch the conventions on TV? Wasn't that great? The American democratic process being enacted there, everybody wearing their little hats and blowing their horns and dancing in the aisles for 50 minutes for candidates that had already been nominated. And yet, that's what this society has been reduced to in terms of the democratic process 200 years after the American Revolution. What about corruption? Now, you know, there's that story about George Washington never telling a lie, and I'm sure that's not true, but look where we stand today, 2 centuries after this nation was founded. Since 1970, over 1,000 officials have been convicted of federal corruption charges throughout the country, 1,000 politicians. And that doesn't include Nixon, because he was never convicted. That doesn't include many others. But just 1,000 of our public officials have been convicted in the last 6 years of corruption charges. And that's in the government sector. Then you look at the corporate sector, and they're not doing that much better. You've seen the recent revelations of illegal activities, of payoffs, of bribes, of scandals, of influence peddling. Around the world right now, nations, governments in Japan and the Netherlands are toppling like dominoes because of U.S. corporate practices. White-collar crime today, and you know, white-collar criminal, a businessman who gets caught pillaging a couple $1 million from the public, he gets a slap on the wrist usually. Maybe he gets a $10,000 fine, maybe he gets to go to some country club jail for 6 months or a year. If you're caught sticking up a gas station, you happen to be poor or black or young, you might go to jail for 10 years. But corporate white-collar crime today costs our society more, according to the Justice Department, than all the other criminal activity we're familiar with, the stick-ups, the hold-ups, the bank robberies, yet the white-collar criminals go free. Finally, a study done by the Conference Board, which is a prestigious polling firm and it relates to the business community, it's very well known, conducted a survey a few months back and asked a number of America's major corporate leaders, you know, there's been a lot of allegations about illegal corporate activity. Would you lie? Would you break the law? Would you cover up a crime within your company even if it was illegal, if you thought it would help your firm. And 50% of the corporate officials polled said that yes, they would go along with crime if they thought it was in the best interest of their company, regardless of the effect on society. Look at America today and our economics. We've got still massive inflation, unemployment, but now it's sort of hit a level where only about 7.5 million Americans are out of work, so we're told that's better, and you know, that things are going along okay, even though just a few years ago we only had 4% unemployment. You know, among unemployed people in America, there's a new category today. There used to be those who had jobs, and then there were the unemployed, and they got benefits. Well, now there's a whole new subcategory that's completely ignored by our society, and the government started to call them exhaustees, because, you know, after you haven't had work for so long, your benefits run out. And now we have exhaustees in our midst. I've never met one. But, I mean, I don't know how they eat or anything, but tens of thousands of people who have no benefits coming to them who've been cast off by this economic system. There's a poll done recently, and I just want to give you a few of these things because I think they're all very indicative of where we stand today and what this bicentennial should mean for this country. A recent poll was done, asked people who their heroes are in America. I don't know who your individual heroes are. I know, you know, I'm not sure who they might be, foreign or domestic. You might think about it for a minute. But the American public, according to this public opinion survey, of its top about 7 or 8 heroes, all the people in their minds who placed over 3 or 4% in terms of being heroes, all of them are either dead or among the living dead. The dead were the highest placed hero in America was Jack Kennedy. He was killed 13 years ago. Then there's Dwight Eisenhower, Harry Truman, a couple other presidents in there. Then there's Dick Nixon. He got about 8%. Then there was George Wallace. He got about 6%. And you had to go all the way down to 3 or 4% before you found people like Ralph Nader. You had to go all the way down to 1% before you found Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, our 2 presidential candidates. And finally, there was a Harris poll that was done, which I think is very shocking. Lou Harris, top pollster in the country, went to a cross-sampling of Americans and said, tell me which institutions you believe in, which institutions you think are going to perform as they're supposed to. And Harris gave all the traditional set of institutions, from church to big business, the FBI, the military, Congress, the White House, you know, the courts, on and on. And he found something that shocked him, and he's been doing polls for decades, that America's allegiance to its major institutions is at rock bottom level. The presidency placed at about 18%, Congress at about 15%. Major corporations, 16%. The military, about 15%. Labor unions, about 12%. They were all down at rock bottom. If you remember, when Richard Nixon was finally thrown out of office, he still had about 20% of the people who believed in him. And he was standing there holding the smoking gun, and yet today our major institutions have absolutely no respect from the American people, except for one. There is one institution that got an overwhelming mandate of support from people like you and I. And that institution and that profession were the garbage collectors of America. Lou Harris found, actually, if you say that in New York City, it's rock bottom there too. But Lou Harris found that about 74% of the American public believes that the garbage collector will show up on Tuesday morning or whenever, and he'll pick up the trash, and he'll take it away, and he'll get disposed of, and that job will be handled, and that's a hell of a lot more than they're willing to say about the President of the United States. 200 years after the Revolution, government of, by, and for the people. Now, in terms of this bicentennial, we, you know, the American Revolution was fought to set up a new kind of government, and it was set out specifically on a charter of freedom that we call the Declaration of Independence. And that document rests in Washington today. I'm going to read you a portion from it a little later, because I think it's as relevant today as it was 200 years ago. And, you know, it talks about inalienable rights and the right to alter or abolish your government and setting up a society that will affect your safety and happiness. Well, we decided at the People's Bicentennial earlier this year to see just how much our government believes that statement of human rights and democratic values. We typed up the key passage from the Declaration of Independence. We put it on a petition form, mimeographed it off. But we didn't put the title at the top, Declaration of Independence. And then we put lines under it like a petition, like you might circulate here on campus for one issue or another. And for 10 mornings in a row, we got all dressed up so we wouldn't put people off, you know, put on ties, and the women in our office put on dresses, and we got real gussied up. And we went down to 8 key federal agencies in Washington. They include the Congress and the White House and the Agriculture Department and the Pentagon HEW and Labor Department, and we asked 2,200 federal employees and bureaucrats coming to work in the morning if they would look at this political petition, and if they agreed with it, sign it. Well, we found that 66% of the people we polled in the government refused to sign the Declaration of Independence. And we decided to ask them why that is. Why wouldn't you sign? You know, is it because of my beard? What's the problem here? Well, overwhelmingly, the people who did not sign the Declaration of Independence, they're very sophisticated. They look, they look at me and say, "No, you can't fool me, buddy. I've seen that radical stuff before. I went to college. I know the Communist Manifesto when I see it." We found people who said it was from Chairman Mao's Little Red Book. We found people who said it's part of every communist ideology throughout world history. Very few of them knew it was the Declaration of Independence. That's how far we've come. And I wouldn't take too much, sort of gratification at the bureaucrats' expense over that, because I bet you that if you did that same survey on campus here, you would find that only about 50% of your fellow students on this college would endorse the Declaration of Independence. Well, that's where we are right now. Oh, one other thing. I was driving in. Any of you have CBs? No CBs here? 1 out of every 4 cars in Iowa has a CB. I saw CBs all over the highway as I was coming in. I mean, it's just incredible. I was reading my CB Times. There's First Mama. All right. Well, CBs are an interesting phenomenon, I think, in America, for a number of different reasons. It's first time in maybe 20 years since we've had TV that people start talking to each other. For 20 years we've sat there and watched this tube every night inundate us with corporate media. And finally, 10 million Americans have CBs now, and they're talking to each other. And not that many people know it, but it's freaking the government out. And it's also freaking out ABC and NBC and CBS. And those 3 corporations in the government are getting ready to clamp down on CBs. I just got hold of a recent study that was commissioned by the White House Office of Telecommunications called, from a company called A.D. Little. They're sort of a RAND Corporation type think tank in Washington. And the government is so worried about CBs and people like you and me talking to each other outside of any context that they can control, that the government now is beginning to formulate plans by 1978 so that everybody who owns the CB will have to be voice printed so that they'll know your voice when it's on the airwaves. The FCC has developed sort of FCC SWAT teams. They're not military yet, but they go to communities, they go harass people who are using CBs for things the government doesn't consider they're cool. In this study, the government, incidentally, anticipates that by 1978 there'll be a massive march on the Capitol, it says, by Citizens for CB. And I think just an interesting phenomenon, something that's going to be coming down the road. So that's where we are. There we are, 200 years after the revolution. Everything's been taken care of. Revolution's been fulfilled, say our leaders. And I want to go into a little bit about what that revolution was all about. Because when I went to school, I learned pretty much that George Washington was the founding father of our country, that he was a good shot. He could throw a silver dollar across the Potomac. Everybody's going around with lace ruffles, and the women had the hoop skirts, and they're making cherry pies and all that good stuff, powdered wigs. But I didn't really learn much about what the revolution was really all about. First of all, it was a revolution. It was a massive upheaval of the social, the economic, the political institutions of a society 200 years ago. And it may not have gone as far as we think it should have gone. It didn't deal with certain issues like women's rights, about the rights of black people, Indians, and other minorities, but it set a course 2 centuries ago, a course that I think has a great deal of bearing on our life today. Now, if you look at the revolution, not for the famous figures, but the issues, you'll find that the burning issues of 200 years ago read like the front page of today's newspaper. It's really uncanny. If you're reading a Massachusetts newspaper from 1776 about this time, the issues are skyrocketing prices, massive unemployment. New York City is going into default 200 years ago. You see leaks of secret government papers. There are boycotts against merchants. There are strikes, and working people are getting together to stop activities by the government. There's all kinds of hectic activity going on throughout the country, just like there is today. Even though you don't read too much about it, there's that same kind of organizing, those same kind of issues 200 years later. And it kept building and building, and the patriots were upset with the king, and they didn't like the wealthy landowners. They started challenging the aristocrats 200 years ago, taking away their large landholding estates. There was one fellow, for instance, whose name was Lord Fairfax. And he was a Tory, he was an aristocrat, he lived in Virginia. He owned 5 million acres of land. Now just to get an idea of how much 5 million acres is, the entire state of New Jersey today is only 4.8 million acres. So he owned more land than New Jersey. Of course, in terms of today, he was in the Little League. Standard Oil Company today, an oil company, owns over 20 million acres of land. But he owned 5 million acres, and the Patriots took it away from him. They overturned feudal landholding codes. They began to broaden the franchise so that more and more people could vote. And there was all this ferment and this activity, but people really weren't ready for revolution until a fellow named Tom Paine came along. Now, I don't know if you heard about Tom Paine. He's not even that popular with a lot of American historians. Even presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, 150 years after Tom Paine lived, called Tom Paine that dirty little atheist. Didn't want to have anything to do with him. And Tom Paine, he was kind of the Malcolm X of his day. You remember Malcolm X? I mean, he died a long time ago. But he was sort of the Malcolm X of his day because Tom Paine was from the working class. He wasn't an aristocrat like Jefferson or Washington or the others. He didn't have a high education. In fact, till he was 36 years old, he lived in England, and he was a dressmaker. He made women's corsets. And yet he came to America in 1774 and helped launch the American Revolution because he looked at the country and he could see what was happening. And like Malcolm X in the 1960s, Tom Paine in the 1770s looked at Americans and he said, "You dumb suckers. You know what's wrong. You know that the king's not the wave of the future. You know we've got problems here, but all you do is sit around on your ass. You don't do anything. You're just trying to pretend it's not happening." So he read a little book called Common Sense. That was the most successful political pamphlet in the history of the world, probably until Chairman Mao's little red book. They published 150,000 copies of it. It was passed from hand to hand beginning in January of 1776. Historians estimate that by March, fully 1 million Americans had either read that pamphlet or had it read to them out of a total population of just 3 million people. 1 out of every 3 people read that book. Think about today. What kind of books get that kind of readership in America? The Exorcist, Jacqueline Suzanne novels. But here is an out-and-out fiery revolutionary tract against the king, and Americans throughout the country read it and debated it and decided that it was right on target. And it was Tom Paine's pamphlet, really, that moved the Continental Congress to call for the revolution because average people like ourselves started demanding it. Now, as they started formulating the revolution, and incidentally, do you remember a slogan? I know must be very big out here because the Midwest is supposed to be where the middle Americans are, the silent majority, Richard Nixon told us. Do you remember that slogan, America, love it or leave it? I remember that. My parents used that for quite a while, too. But they finally came around, though. They ended up in opposition to the war. But that slogan, America, love it or leave it, that was used by the government in the 1960s was a perversion on a revolutionary slogan that was thought up 200 years ago. And I was reading a newspaper in the Library of Congress, and there, in this newspaper, somebody's writing, and he said, look, if you don't like America, he put it this way, America, love it or Nova Scotia. That's what the Patriots said to the Tories 200 years ago. If you go to Nova Scotia today, you'll find people there, thousands of people who are descended from the Tories. Eventually, 100,000 aristocrats, friends of the king, the enemies of democracy, call them what you will, were booted out of this country. Lock, stock, and barrel, sent all over the world. And as they were doing all that, they were also formulating, back in the 1770s, a very radical political philosophy, something that was so unprecedented 200 years ago that it didn't just shake up King George, but it sent shudders through throne rooms throughout Europe. And it became a beacon light for radicals throughout the world at the time. And in fact, the principles of the American Revolution have been ingrained in every revolutionary movement right up to our own day. I'd like to read you a few quotations from the founders. These are not quotations from Chairman Mao. These are quotations from the founding fathers. And just think about these and ask yourself, when's the last time that a politician in America said something that was so right on target, that was so pithy, that summed up the issues so well that you would actually look at that, you'd adopt that as part of your political credo. Maybe you'd sit around with your friends in your rooms here on campus and you'd debate that. I mean, I can't think of a single quotation that Gerald Ford has made, for instance, except he did say the State of the Union is not good and our long national nightmare is over. But in terms of political quotation, listen to a few of these. Noah Webster, you remember him, father of the American Dictionary, use it every day on your papers probably. Well, he not only put together the American Dictionary, but he was a revolutionary. You don't hear much about that. And Noah Webster said, "An equality of property with the necessity of constantly destroying combinations of powerful families is the very soul of a republic." The father of the dictionary. Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States, "I sincerely believe with you that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies." Jefferson went on to warn his fellow Americans, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations before they bid defiance to the laws of our country." And on and on. That's the kind of stuff, I think those kind of quotations are the victim of a 200-year cover-up, because you never learned that that's what the founders believed, that that's the kind of thing they had to say. Pennsylvania farmers in a state like this, I think this is very relevant. A group of them in the 1780s wrote, "No man is entitled to a greater portion of this earth than another. Land was made for the use of all." Another group of farmers in Maryland wrote, "Where wealth is concentrated into the hands of a few, power is concentrated into the hands of a few, for wealth is power." Those are the kind of thoughts, and that's certainly the radical strain, but it is an important strain of the American Revolution. Let me leave you with one other quote. This is the quiz. Do you have blue books on campus here? If this was a test here, you could all guess. This is 20 questions. What founding father had this to say about his society? "It is much to be lamented that each state, long before this, has not hunted monopolizers down as the pests of society and the greatest enemies we have to the happiness of America. I would to God that one of the most atrocious of each state was hung in gibbets upon a gallows 5 times as high as the one prepared by Haman. No punishment, in my opinion, is too great for the man who can build his greatness upon his country's ruin." That's an interesting quotation, because the Justice Department today says that every industry, good and service in America is the victim of a shared monopoly, a couple giant corporations controlling over 50% more of the market. And that quotation was said by George Washington, father of our country, that mellow man on the $1 bill. That's what he had to say about monopolizers 200 years ago. Now, there you have it. Those are some of the principles. That is definitely one strain of the revolution, and that's the strain that we at the People's Bicentennial Commission have believed in, have taken as our own credo. We get our inspiration from the founding fathers and mothers on those kinds of issues. We think they speak directly to our society today. What it meant was that when America was founded, it was founded upon a new philosophy. And that was that in this country, everybody, every citizen, should have a voice and a vote over the major decisions that affect our lives. That's what sets us apart from everybody else. That this should be a government of, by, and for the people. After 2 centuries, it's evolved down to us through a long process is the concept of one person, one vote. And I suspect that everybody here believes that. There are some in society who don't. There's some new Tories in America today. There's no doubt about that. But that notion of one person, one vote, to me, speaks directly to the problem we have here today in America. Because if you believe in democracy, if you believe in the concept of one person, one vote, then you have to look at how decisions are made in this government. And I have rarely met any person in America who believes that their vote, when you go to the poll on November 2nd, now it's only a couple months away, most of you said you're going to vote, and when you enter that polling booth, are you going to seriously believe that your vote on that day and the vote of your fellow citizens is going to carry as much weight over the as much influence and weight over the basic decisions in the direction of our government as do Exxon, GM, or ITT? That the average citizen is going to have as much influence as America's, say, 200, 300 largest corporations. Now, I haven't met anybody who really believes that, who doesn't believe that once the politicians are elected that they're more responsive to the big moneyed interest, the fat cats, if you will, to use some old-fashioned populist rhetoric, than the average citizen. There are some people who don't believe that the politicians should be as responsive to you and I. You remember H.L. Hunt? He's a Texas oil millionaire. He died recently. He's a very interesting cat, worth billions and billions of dollars, yet every day he still drove his 1954 Plymouth to work. He carried a little brown bag. He's sort of, with his luncheon, he's sort of frugal. And he wrote a book called Alpaca. You might want to check this out. He wrote this in the 50s, I believe, where he said, no, the government isn't as influenced by the average citizen as big business, and it shouldn't be. If you've got lots of money, then you've earned it. God has sort of given you that right. to exploit it as you see fit, and therefore you should have more influence than anyone else. But I don't think most of us believe that. I think that what we need to do is discuss both the governing political and governing economic system in this country. Now, politically, we have a democracy. Economically, we have capitalism. That's what we call it, capitalism. It's not what Adam Smith had in mind, but that's what we call it. And to my mind, capitalism and democracy just cannot exist together. I think that capitalism has perverted our democratic way of life, our democratic political principles. And while some say that you can't have one without the other, I'd like to give you some statistics that I think show that we've got to separate the two out. That maybe it's time that we begin a second American Revolution in this country. Not a revolution of violence and armies in the street, but a revolution of principle that's going to challenge the new corporate monarchy and aristocracy today, just as our founders challenged King George 2 centuries before. Now, you remember those Maryland farmers who said that where wealth is concentrated, power is concentrated, for wealth is power. They're the same thing. Well, listen to a few statistics. Now, I know economics is usually a pretty boring affair, so I'm not going to bore you to tears with it. I just want to give you a few government statistics about the economic system of this country. And let's get away from talking about the free enterprise system and supply and demand and all those nice high school textbook slogans and look at what's really happening.